Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of Indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, and welcome back. This is Let's Talk Native with John Kane. This is one of those shows that I got to make some references back to my previous podcast, my previous show. And I'm not going to reiterate the previous show, but one of the things that I talked about, and the reason I talked about it was slavery, and the fact that chattel slavery, the slavery that Joe Biden appeared to be offering some remorse over to the Jacobs family, Jacob Blake's family, in his visit to Kenosha, is not the slavery of Native people. So, I mean, let me back it up here. What I offered was, sorry, Joe, but genocide and land theft were America's original sin, not the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And when it was shortened, it just says not slavery. Now, I got some pushback. And most people got what I was saying. And I think even some of the people who were offering some pushback, they got what I was saying. But, I get it. People want to offer their 2 cents on some of these issues. And what was a common theme was, no, slavery existed before genocide. Native people were enslaved. And again, I want to give its proper due. It's the slavery that took place at the hands of Columbus, of the Taino, the Arawak, the people of the Caribbean, what would be called the Caribbean. I got bells and whistles going on everywhere here. So what Biden was talking about was not slavery of Native people. So to put in context what I was talking about, what I was saying was that the slavery that Joe Biden appeared to be apologizing or again, feigning some remorse over when he went to Kenosha was not the slavery. It was not the genocide committed against our people. In fact, that gets ignored. It gets ignored completely by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. So the reason I brought it up is I took offense to it. In fact, I would argue that how genuine his remorse was over slavery by calling it America's original sin is the credibility of that remorse is challenged by the fact that he wouldn't acknowledge that Native people were enslaved. Native people had genocide committed against them. Native people had their land stolen. So when I put it in that order, I say the first sins of America are genocide, land theft, and then slavery. The enslavement of Native people are part of the genocide and are part of the land theft. So, again, I appreciate people correcting me, or offering their thoughts on the subject. But again, to be clear, Joe Biden wasn't talking about the enslavement of Native people at the hands of Christopher Columbus, or the first transatlantic slave ship being one of Columbus's ship bringing little girls back to Spanish elite. So, I just want people to understand. I wasn't mistaken, and I have no problem admitting to a mistake. But I think the context of the slavery that I was talking about And my criticism of Joe Biden was that he wasn't offering any remorse to the enslavement of that first ship of Native people being sent back to Spain, so Columbus could celebrate some trophies. No, he wasn't. Joe Biden was specifically talking about the African slavery, the chattel slavery of the United States. Now, here's the other thing I want to say. Anybody who was saying, well, all people, had slaves, all cultures, at some point in their history, participated in slavery. And I said it before, and I'll say it again. The slavery that the United States was involved in, and the early the colonies in North America, was unique throughout the world. And so there was no other place in the world where slavery had reached the level of privateering and profiteering that America had accomplished, the United States had accomplished. In fact, by almost any account of assessing the worth of American industry in the mid 1800s, even 1860 or whatever, the number one set or asset of the United States were slaves. Now, and so slaves were not just kidnapped and dragged across an ocean. They were these people who were enslaved and were victimized through this chattel slavery system industry. Industry, where they were forced to breed in captivity, had their children whisked away. They were bought and sold. They were a commodity. They were treated as not as human beings, beasts of burden. And unlike some other cultures for thousands of years where you might have had an occupying force that enslaved people for a while until they could be incorporated into their citizenry. And I'm not defending that kind of slavery either, but that's not what took place in the United States. And even the enslavement of Native people, it was a little different. And I'm not saying it was less less of a tragedy or less of an atrocity. It certainly was. But in fact, in many ways, it was more. But what I was talking about with Joe Biden's overture in Kenosha, Wisconsin, was that it was disingenuous because it didn't address America's, the United States' original sin, the original sin of genocide, which, again, included murder, included mutilation, included enslavement, and enslavement at a level where the property that they had claimed of these human beings almost had no value except for what they could hand to them in terms of something of value. So the idea of killing a slave, and it's not to say that slaves weren't killed in America's, in the United States, chattel slavery industry, but they were killed at a level where somebody would assess were they more problematic than they were worth in terms of their labor. And the indiscriminate killing of Native people by Columbus and his men was not necessarily tied to even the worth of a human being as a slave. So I need to say that. Now, and again, it's important that people realize that the slavery that the United States was guilty of was unique in all the world. And look, just in case people aren't aware of, we talked about statues coming down and that kind of thing. Among the statues that are being removed and names to streets and buildings and stuff like that is the name of Millard Fillmore. Now, for those who didn't know, and I wasn't sure why there was so much pushback about on Millard Fillmore. I knew he had some ties to Western New York, and I didn't really know what that history was. So I looked it up a little bit. And the issue with Millard Fillmore is that he was the president who not just signed it into law, but embraced the Fugitive Slave Act. And I bring this up because it connects to this notion of this unique situation and the uniqueness of the slavery industry, the chattel slavery industry in the United States. Think about a president from Buffalo, New York, who essentially signs into law that even if you escape slavery, and you make it to and make it to a place where slavery is not necessarily legal, or that a black man could be a free person, you could be apprehended, and that turns into a whole other business. The Fugitive Slave Act was this set of laws that allowed plantation owners, individuals who felt like their property had been taken from them because of a runaway slave. So this was an attempt to basically undermine the Underground Railroad and to really harm the abolitionist movement. And that's what Millard Fillmore was, as a president, was responsible for. So again, I bring this stuff up because this stuff is just, to me, it's almost crazy. I mean, when you think about how much even northern states, and again, Millard Fillmore with his ties to Buffalo, how much northern states were just as guilty of many of the atrocities committed during this chattel slavery era. But again, just to clarify the memes that I've posted and some of your responses, and I don't mind the responses, but I felt like, okay, let me clarify. The slavery that I'm talking about is the slavery that Biden was talking about. And what Biden was apologizing for, or expressing some remorse for, or suggesting that this original sin is what that America still needs to confront. I think it challenges his credibility when you ignore the fact that Native people suffered slavery, and he wasn't talking about that. Native people suffered through genocide, and they suffered through land loss. And here's the other thing: it's easy to apologize for for slavery when it comes to black people, because for one thing, apologies mean almost nothing. But you can say it because you can say, well, we freed them. That the slavery ended, so the sin was corrected. Now, there was no contrition associated with this correction or this absolution of this sin. But to say, okay, yeah, we had that slavery thing, but we fixed it. We outlawed slavery, and the black men were freed. Well, the reason that there won't be the proper acknowledgement of the atrocities and the crimes against humanity committed against Native people. Look, most U.S. politicians will not embrace this notion of the American genocide. They don't. I mean, and it's not just Trump who rejects that. Again, Joe Biden suggesting that slavery was America's original sin is essentially erasing the true original sin, which was genocide. But see, here's the thing: when you can say, and I'm not saying that black people have been adequately freed or compensated or reparated. I'm not suggesting any of that. But when a white man gets in and say, "Well, we freed the slaves, so we fixed it." Well, the funny thing is, you didn't give the land back, and you didn't go back to acknowledging our free and independent existence. So our freedom is still tied to being subjugated by you. So you can't. The reason, and this is my belief, is the reason we can't get an acknowledgement about the original sins committed against our people is because they're still doing it. They still have the land. They still are, and they don't just still have the land they took. They're still trying to take control of the lands that we occupy. We're still in this pitted battle over land use. And we're still in this pitted battle, rejecting or pushing back against assimilation. Assimilation, I said it before, assimilation is genocide. So the genocide didn't end. It didn't end with, with the 14th Amendment. It didn't end with the Indian Citizenship Act. It didn't end with any of this stuff. It still is going on. If you ask any politician, and it's not even just ask them, if you try to tell a politician, well, you don't represent me, they're going to say, oh, yes, we do. I said, no, but you don't represent the land that I live on. Oh, yes, we do. I literally have gotten into these arguments with the staff folks at a congressman's office or at a senator's office. They don't get the fact that we reject their claim to representing our people and our lands. They can't embrace it. Why? Because they're still trying to impose their subjugation, their submission. They're still trying to make us, submit to their jurisdiction and to their governing authority. So I think it's really important that people understand this. You can't apologize for something you're still doing. And if you jam two sticks in somebody's eyes and you pull one out, you don't deserve praise for that because the other eye still has a stick in it. So this is one of the things. And look, I do appreciate people commenting on a post because it encourages a conversation. So whether somebody is critiquing or trying to correct something that I said, keep bringing it on because that allows me to clarify. It allows me, look, even some of the ridiculous and the racist comments. Somebody posted that clown who's the vice president of the Navajo Nation. What the hell's his name again? Myron Lizer. Giving some COVID update, and I said, look, this guy is a Trump suck up, and he lost all credibility. Somebody says, well, I'm not afraid to hear diverging opinions. I'm not afraid of it. In fact, I didn't remove the post from my page. I just said his credibility is corrupted because he's sucking up to Donald Trump and praising him for the handling of COVID-19, the pandemic, and then he's offering some sort of statement on where the Navajo Nation is with COVID-19. I'm sorry. I just am going to have a little trouble wrapping my head around the veracity of anything this guy has to say because he seems to have a skewed view of what is the proper handling of a pandemic because of the view that he expresses towards Trump. And he went on national television to praise Trump's handling of the pandemic. So is that the guy I want to listen to who's going to tell me how great the Navajo Nation is handling COVID-19 and their color-coded system and all that other stuff? I hope for the best. I wish the best for that, and I hope that the tide is turning. I just don't believe it. Look, I know a lot of people are praising the fact that the COVID-19 numbers of confirmed by test cases has dropped below 30,000 for a couple of days in a row here in the United States, I guess. The problem is I don't necessarily trust the day-to-day numbers, especially since they somehow get impacted by a Sunday. Every Sunday the numbers are lower. Do we really think that Sundays, people are less sick on Sunday? Is this a church thing? I don't know. Or a holiday? No. Part of it has to do with the fact that testing is being manipulated. And so the number of cases and the number of deaths by COVID-19 are clearly higher than what the United States and, frankly, most other countries are reporting. And so I use the numbers that I talk about on this show only as reference, not as legitimate, factual information on how many people are sick. And of course, what I will say about numbers dropping below 30,000 for a couple of days in a row, that's going to make it even seem worse when the numbers are upticked because of school, kids returning back to school. The other thing I got to mention is, I talked about all these guys heading out to Sturgis for their motorcycle rally. By some estimates, there are 250,000 cases that have been linked to the 500,000 people who went to Sturgis for their motorcycle rally, and the cost is in the millions, possibly the billions of dollars associated with over 250,000 people, and I've heard as high as 260,000 or something like that. So, it's absurd that those who want to express their freedom and their belief that the COVID-19 thing was a hoax end up exacerbating, the situation by attending these huge rallies. And again, what was one of the arguments? Well, how come everybody's saying 250,000 people, have been linked to Sturgis, but nobody's talking about the uptick of cases with all of these protests. Well, I got to tell you, part of it is because these protests aren't people partying and swapping spit and going into bars. The protests are people wearing masks, trying in any way possible to observe some level of social distancing. Yeah, there's a lot of people out there, but they aren't partying, and there's a different atmosphere when you're when you're socializing than when you're protesting. So and that was, I think the news was looking for an uptick in corona cases after some of these these street protests, and I think that they were probably surprised. I think much of the mainstream media was surprised that there wasn't an uptick, but and obviously they looked for it after this motorcycle rally, and guess what? Yeah, they got it there. I mean, immediately they knew there were hundreds of cases, and then those hundreds of cases, turn into thousands of cases, and those thousands of cases. That's kind of the way a pandemic works. It expands geometrically. Well, and that's what's happened. So, congratulations, you guys. You guys have done a great job for. God bless America. Hey, all right. I do have something else that I'm going to get into, and I'll just kind of present it before I go to break. It'll give people a chance to wrap their heads around something a little bit here. I did hear another radio program that was addressing Buck v. Bell. If you don't know what Buck v. Bell is, it is it's a case from 1927 where essentially the Supreme Court, and I think it was in a 7-1 decision, approved the idea of sterilization of people who could be regarded as imbeciles, epileptics, or feeble-mindedness. It is where eugenics. I mean, it's funny because when people think about Darwinism and natural selection and how somebody tweaks this to this idea, well, if natural selection can improve a species, what if we manipulate it unnaturally? And that's what eugenics is, right? And so when people think about eugenics, they automatically think of Nazis, right? No, it isn't Nazis. It was the United States. And in fact, if anything, the United States became the breeding ground for some of these eugenics conversations that would take place in other countries. But eugenics is this notion that you could sterilize and you could breed out unwanted characteristics. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because eugenics, the concept is, again, breeding in or breeding out certain characteristics. So the first way to really practice with this is trying to take advantage of people who are marginalized, and you can marginalize them whether there's a handicap, a mental handicap, or whether there's a medical or physical handicap like epilepsy, or just getting in trouble with the law and somebody saying, you know what, this person is genetically damaged, and they're never going to amount to anything. Their kids are never going to amount to anything, and their kids are never going to amount to anything. So we might just as well sterilize them now. Now, keep in mind, the sterilization is not a punishment. It is being regarded as something that you do as a greater good for society. That you're going to improve society by not allowing a certain class or a certain type of person to have children. Now, why am I bringing this up on Let's Talk Native? Because in this whole program that I was listening to on the radio, and then as I started looking, delving into it a little bit more online, there's almost no conversation about how this concept and this law, this ruling in court, which was done intentionally. I mean, this isn't something that just, got challenged and brought to the Supreme Court because somebody was trying to overturn this. No, I think it was the state of West Virginia specifically chose the Bucks, 3 generations of Bucks, I guess, because they felt like they would have the most solid argument and the most solid case for why this thing should be legalized at the federal level, because there was nothing on the books essentially, and this was so that's what this was all about. But it was about this idea that you could improve humanity through eugenics. Well, again, what's not mentioned is the sterilization of Native people. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into this thing because what's missing in most of the conversations about how the racist nature of things like residential schools or sterilization was that it wasn't about some assessment of somebody's mental capacity. It wasn't some assessment of a disability, mental or physical. It was just a determination that Native people, by being Native people, were already mentally disabled. They were, in the words of Keith Burrick, professor at Canisius College, author of The Thomas Indian School and The Irredeemable Children of New York, is that Native kids were being legally deemed irredeemable. And if you can do that, and you've got Buck v. Bell on the books, you can sterilize young Native girls. You can sterilize them before you release them. So from your residential school. So that's what I'm going to talk about when we come back. So this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back with this tough subject when we come back. All right. Hey, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. The day after Labor Day, essentially. It's funny to have a holiday that's supposed to celebrate labor at a time when where unions have essentially been busted by capitalism, and the right to work laws, which are anything but really protecting the rights of workers. I mean, it's kind of insane. Hey, I want to give a shout out to my WPFW listeners, and all of you who listen in the various ways. There's a podcast, there's a YouTube video, it's a Facebook live stream, and of course we are a radio show as well. But I will say, if you're not subscribed to our podcast, if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, Let's Talk Native TV, you're missing some content. And again, in the first half hour, I addressed a previous show and some of the content on there. So I encourage people to subscribe to our podcast. If you go to your smart speaker or Google search, Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcasts, you will find we show up on every major platform for podcasts, and you sign up for the RSS feed, and you'll catch all of our content. You'll catch all of our audio content. You won't catch all of our video content unless you subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll get our short form videos. And it's interesting. I was delving back in, looking for some of the old videos that I did, and I reposted a video that we didn't actually shoot. Jake pulled it off of the UN video feeds that they had. It was when I spoke at the UN a couple of years ago on their World Indigenous Peoples Day, and was kind of rudely interrupted by the moderator. And then she said, "Would you please get to a question?" And then I got to a question, and then she and others refused to answer it. So. There's a lot of videos that are out there. Some of them are shows, but some of them are things like this, a video feed from the UN. Some of our short form videos. We did a series of shows that we call Why It Matters, and so there's a lot of good videos there, and I know the way people view a lot of the stuff is just the stuff that they come across. It shows up on Facebook. It gets reposted. But and I will do that. I'm going to delve into some of those older videos and just repost them on Twitter or someplace. So, because as I look at some of the old stuff that we did, that some of the people who are listening and watching now probably are not familiar with, all the content is valid today. It's as valid today as it was the day we recorded it. So we'll play around with that a little bit. But I do encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast, and that way you'll catch more content that you may, if you're only looking for what comes through your feed, you're going to miss some stuff. So I encourage you to look back. Look, I also I was talking about Buck v. Bell. I think it's important that people realize that law or that ruling is still in the books. It's never been overturned. What did happen, and again, Buck v. Bell, for those who may have joined in late, was a landmark ruling. I think it was 7-1. The judges ruled that eugenics was legal. That states or that it was legal to sterilize somebody against their will because somebody else determines that they may not be genetically viable for the good of of all, humanity, I guess. The crazy part is some of the people who would make that argument or who argued for eugenics, they cited Darwin and Darwinism, right? Here's the problem with that. Darwin made it very clear that one of the main components that contributed to this theory of natural selection, improving a species or species, was variability. Because we don't understand why there's variability. And there, I know people can get all religious about, God always has a plan. God always has a reason. Well, I don't know all about that. But I will say that what we may not understand as variability in somebody's genetic, code, or, perhaps some characteristic, we may not know why or if that variability has value until something is confronted. So, maybe it makes somebody more disease resistant to a certain strain, maybe a COVID-19, who knows? But variability in our DNA. So when you try to manipulate that and you say, okay, we're going to take away this variability and we're going to determine what is feeble-mindedness, what is a disability, what is, a characteristic that can be bred out. And of course, it's impossible to pinpoint a characteristic so narrowly that you don't have any other adverse effects. So the very people who cited Darwin as their as a reference or as an argument for eugenics missed the point. And look, and I'm not just sitting here trying to praise up Darwin or anybody else, but what I will say is that Darwin understood that what made natural selection work was the fact that there were little variations in every species. And those small variations may determine a species' survivability or advancement. So again, all right. So again, why am I talking about Buck v. Bell? It's not look, there are all kinds of native cases we could cite, right? We can talk about all kinds of Supreme Court decisions. We can talk about all kinds of racist laws and everything else that had us in mind. This didn't have us in mind. But what was unique in what would play out is that Native people would be characterized racially along our ethnic and racial lines as being feeble-minded. Look, Thomas Indian School. They call it Thomas Indian School, but they used to call it Salem. You know why they called it Salem? Nothing to do with burning witches. Salem was asylum. It was just bastardized, language, vernacular. Asylum got twisted into Salem. These schools were called asylums, and in fact, and this is what Keith Burke talks about in his book again, the Thomas Indian School and the Irredeemable Children of New York. That's what he talked about, was this notion that the states and the United States were looking at native as that native identity was a mental handicap. And so even some of this notion that kill the Indian, save the man, if we can get rid of the primitive underlying teachings that Native people have, they can be productive members of American society. That wasn't really the only strategy at play here. I mean, it wasn't the only policy. Among the policies was that we got to put these kids in these schools because they don't belong anyplace else. They belong in these, and that's why these schools were like prisons, and that's why kids would be beaten for trying to leave them. And look, the kids that were whisked away to these schools, they weren't just whisked away because of behavior. Now, granted, there had come a time where the policies of the United States had destroyed families, had destroyed communities, had made survival very, very difficult. And so kids were in many ways the damage caused by these policies. But the fact that the United States and the states were regarding Native kids as just being mentally deficient, irredeemable children because they were Native, That made them prime candidates for sterilization. And I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I was learning about this, Buck v. Bell, and how the pushback that even came fairly recently. There was an attempt by a specific lawyer who wanted to try to go through the West Virginia courts, I think it was, to see what it would take to have somebody sterilized in it now. I mean, look, Buck v. Bell was passed in 1927. Many states had already rejected this notion of forced sterilization, but not all states. So this attorney wanted to go through this process, and as soon as kind of the hysteria started growing about what he was doing, the state legislature got rid of it. They abandoned the legal process of court ordered sterilizations. So what the attorney did after that was said, okay, well, I'm going to sue. Let me find some people some survivors of these sterilizations. And so he decided he was going to push a case and try to, I don't know if it was a class action suit or something, and began the process. Now some states felt like, oh, look, we're not going to be embarrassed by this, so they began compensating. I think in North Carolina, they were paying survivors of the sterilization $50,000, per person. Look, that is not a sufficient number for stripping away somebody's ability to have a family legacy. But that's what they did. And they felt that was a cheap way out, and it was better than being sued. And if you start dangling $50,000 in front of a bunch of people, especially if many of these people maybe did have some level of mental handicap. So you start dangling $50,000. In fact, West Virginia, getting back to West Virginia, they said, hell, we don't need to offer $50,000. We'll just offer $25,000. So they cut the number in half, and thousands of people were paid these reparations for having been sterilized under this program, and other states that did it as well. No Native people were compensated for this. And I don't look, this idea of sterilization, it probably predated Buck v. Bell. I mean, sterilization was happening in many of these states before the Supreme Court ruling. What was unique about Buck v. Bell was the people who were committing the sterilization knew that they were on pretty solid ground, and they thought they could get a positive ruling. In fact, they even hooked up the lawyer representing the Buck girl who was sterilized. He was a eugenics supporter. So look, it was just a scam. It was a scam. So even as she was being represented by counsel, she was being represented by counsel by somebody who was, almost directly related to the institution that committed, that was responsible for the sterilization in the first place. I mean, it's really that twisted. And this isn't Nazi Germany, folks. This is the United States. Buck v. Bell, 1927. That's the 20th century, folks. And the law is still in the books. It's never been overturned. But again, the reason I'm bringing it up, and I don't know what the total number is. I know one of the things that was kind of a bit of a thunderbolt was that when the BIA was taken over in the 70s by AIM and others, that was among some of the material that they had gathered up was some of the documents associated with sterilization programs. And these sterilization programs were tied to residential schools, but also to Indian health services. There were Native people who were coerced into sterilization, and oftentimes this would be tied to somebody who had a child, and they would threaten somebody. Well, if you don't allow us to end your ability to have children, you will be denied this, or you will be denied that. So it wasn't the court ordered sterilization per se under codified into law by Buck v. Bell, but it was still coerced sterilization. And in some cases, there were Native women, young Native women, who had no idea this was happening to them. Look, there were pelvic exams being given to Native women who would get some sort of pass to go home for a period of time, the first thing that they would do is jump on the table with the stirrups and they would get a pelvic exam. I mean, it is insane that this is some of the stuff that occurred. But again, what stuck out to me as I was listening to this program and started reading a little bit, I can find no place that anybody involved the sterilization of Native people into the conversation related to specifically to eugenics and specifically to these court ordered, and the idea that you could legally sterilize somebody because of their mental capacity. And but even though I can't find that tie, and I encourage people, maybe Professor Keith Burke will take a look into this even farther, or some of the people who have already done some of this work. But what concerned me is when I look at Keith's, Professor Burke's work, I realized that one of the things that he found most appalling was this notion that there was this determination, carte blanche, that Native kids were somehow feeble-minded, and that they were, they could be dubbed irredeemable without a crime, without any assessment of a behavior, just by virtue of being Native. That could, and that these schools were being called asylums. They weren't just being called a school. It wasn't just the Indian school. They were being regarded as some sort of mental institution, and that was the nature of what residential schools had been. And again, I want to be clear: sterilization was not confined to post-pubescent girls in residential schools. This practice of sterilization of Native women was something that was happening all over the U.S. and Canada, mind you, as a way to diminish our population. And it's interesting because as I was watching this or listening to this program, they talked about this notion of sterilization was an extermination. But only in the case of Native people is it an ethnic cleansing. Only in the case of Native people is the sterilization race-based. In all of this other conversation about eugenics in the United States, it was really trying to assess an individual's mental capacity, individual, not based on necessarily. I'm not saying they didn't lump a bunch of people because of social class or perhaps race into some of these categories, but in the case of Native people, it was clear that they were regarding Native kids as mentally handicapped just by virtue of being Native, and that's still incredible to me. So as Canada, went through their so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you get through this notion of truth and reconciliation, and I don't know how you reconcile an atrocity like that. And of course, the United States doesn't even have that conversation. Like I said, neither political party even wants to acknowledge the genocide that Native people experienced. They'll take ownership of slavery and suggest that that maybe they'll even consider at some point some level of reparations. I mean, that conversation's not off the table, but almost nobody talks about the America's original sin that and that genocide includes the sterilization. And includes, murder and rape and all of that stuff, and of course, land theft is a part of that as well. So, and it's interesting. I didn't really think about when I was going to talk about these two subjects how much they come together, and the whole time as I'm listening to this story about Buck v. Bell, I'm thinking they gotta mention sterilization of Native people. It just doesn't happen. See. We talk about erasure. Even today, as I was going through some documents and trying to do some other work on something that I was involved in, and there's always this emphasis about calling our past a rich culture, our rich culture, and our, our storied history. And we don't talk about as much how much we had to persevere through adversity. You can't talk about our storied history as if it's a story, a fairy tale. It's rife with adversity and death. And if you're going to talk about somebody's perseverance or resilience, then you better talk about what they had to persevere through and resilience to what. If you're going to talk about the fact that we're still trying to preserve our values, the word preserves, I mean, even when you talk about canning and making preserves, what you're doing is you're trying to create an environment that can fight off bacteria. So when we're trying to preserve something, what are we preserving it from? It isn't just from attrition. We're trying to preserve something from attack. We're trying to preserve our identity. And when I hear language like, preserving or protecting sovereignty, no. I meing, not completely. What we're trying to do is assert sovereignty. We're trying to assert our identity. We're not just trying to teach our children about what took place in the past, especially the long past. We need to have conversations about what took place this year, what's happening now, what happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, some of the greatest accomplishments we have had as Native people were sometimes small victories in our fight against the state. This surviving, influenza or smallpox or venereal diseases that were imposed through the rape culture of Europe, or tuberculosis that was allowed to run wild through residential schools. It wasn't just surviving those diseases. It was surviving the intent of U.S. and Canadian policy to use those diseases to diminish our population. They called it, they say, no, they don't even call it murder. They don't call it, extermination. They literally call it depopulation, like it's a defoliant or something. When you say depopulation, it sounds almost scientific. It doesn't sound like it's a crime against humanity. So when we talk about, some of this history, it's important that we talk about the triumph of survival, but it's not done without a cost. We lost millions of people since European contact. And I don't mean just that millions of people died. They were taken from us by U.S. policy, by European policy. This is what happened. And I think there's a hesitancy to really dwell on the atrocities that were committed. And I'm not trying to paint us as victims, as pitiful victims. I'm trying to paint us as triumphant survivors of a genocide that has no match in all of human history. 500 years? Over 500 years of genocide? And look, and I know, some people say, well, yeah, but genocide doesn't really continue. Yes, it does. And that's what I'm talking about. The idea of erasing us, that's why I talk about mascots. That's why I talk about some of the things we talk about here, defending our lands. All of this is about erasure. That's why I oppose so much this idea that we need to, be absorbed into the American electorate, into American citizenry. That's erasing who we are. And they're already trying to erase who we were, because it is being treated as if it was this thing long ago. Even when people talk, look, when they talk about history, Native American history, and I don't like that term, Native American, but when they talk about Native history, it's like 87%, I think it was, of all lessons or all mentions within U.S. curriculum of Native history stops at the 1900s. So it's like we cease to exist as defined people. I mean, and how crazy is it that in 1927 they try to pass this, omnibus, omnipresent law that says every Native person is now being declared a U.S. citizen. So, but in their attempt to do that, and they were already trying to do that, it suggests that we no longer existed as Native people. That's the termination program. That's one of the 5 policies. Termination. We don't have to acknowledge that you exist anymore. Not as a distinct people. We don't have to kill you anymore. We just put you on a different list now. We don't have to regard you as a native. That's erasure. That's genocide. Again, genocide isn't just murder. It isn't just sterilization. It isn't just torture and mutilation. It isn't just forced migrations away from lands, that are unsustainable. It is any of those things. It's creating any condition that would cause the people to cease to exist. And one of the ways you can cause the people to cease to exist is change our names. Change what we call ourselves. Change what we're called. Call us Indians. Call us Redskins. Or when you use those words, let's pretend that they don't really mean us anymore. They mean a people who don't exist anymore. So when they look at us, oh yeah, well you guys are like, you're Native Americans. You're like descendants of an indigenous population. In fact, that's kind of the international definition of indigenous peoples are descendants of a people prior to colonization. That's why I have some problem with that word indigenous, unless I take the time to explain it. See, there's so much that happens within language because language creates policy. And again, if we only value ourselves as some integration into American culture or a subculture of American culture, that's erasure. That's assimilation. Integration is assimilation. And there's, so when people think about, being, integration and fighting integration when it comes to civil rights, this is something different because we have our own lands. We still, they've been diminished significantly through some of this policy, through genocide, but we are a distinct population and trying to maintain that distinction and our ability to govern ourselves and to carry ourselves and to administer our use and needs of the lands that we do still retain. This is an ongoing battle. It's a fight that we are still as engaged in today as we ever were. Our populations are smaller. Our land bases are smaller. But in the world that we live in today, what we do as a distinct population that can somehow be disassociated with the corruption of American politics, with the degrading of land environmentally, the more that we can assert ourselves on a different path than our neighbors, the better off we're going to be. And you know what? It isn't to deride or condemn the people that we live next to. It's to say there's another path. And the path that we had before your ancestors showed up is the one that we're returning to. And you might want to take a look at what we're doing because your survival may depend on it as well. I know this is kind of a roundabout way to to deal with these converging subjects in some of this conversation. But, again, I think it's important that people realize that we do not live in a vacuum. Some of the stuff that we are faced with is driven not even by policy that people can necessarily identify right now, but systemic racism, things that have been going on for so long that it becomes normalized and it doesn't stand out. So, again, that's why the mascot issue is an issue. And that's why we talk about, so many of these things. We have to oppose some of the conditions that have existed. So, again, I want to thank you guys for bearing with me as I kind of meander through a couple of different subjects here. by all means, check out Buck v. Bell. And at some point, maybe we'll get Keith Burke or some other folks on to talk about the connection between eugenics and sterilization of Native people. I'm not the first person to have this conversation, but I am trying to make sure this conversation continues to be had. So let's do it. I want to thank you guys for listening. I am John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll see you next time. Yahweh.